Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 603 of the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, we are looking forward to revisiting our interview with Dr. Charles Cockell, originally published on March 4th of 2015. Listeners, Charles is a distinguished astrobiologist who has been working to understand how life adapts to various extreme environments. His research projects have ranged from examining how microbes extract energy and nutrients from rocks to the habitability of extraterrestrial environments, including the planet Mars. In our conversation, Charles discusses the twists and turns of his career, his passions outside of science, advice, and more. So listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to be here today with Dr. Charles Cockell. So welcome to our show, Charles. How are you today?
Thanks a lot. I'm very well, thank you. Yeah.
Great. Well, we are excited to chat with you. Now, listeners, Charles is a professor of astrobiology in the School of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Edinburgh. He's also director of the UK Centre for Astrobiology. Now, in addition, Charles is the founder and chair of the Earth and Space Foundation, and also the co-founder, current board member, and past president of the Association of Mars Explorers. He has also been elected as an international fellow of the Explorers Club. Now, Charles did his undergraduate training in biochemistry and molecular biology at Bristol University, and he received his PhD in molecular biophysics from the University of Oxford. And prior to joining the faculty at the University of Edinburgh, where he is today, Charles was a National Academy of Sciences associate with NASA, a visiting scholar at both Stanford University and the University of Arizona, as well as a research scientist at the British Antarctic Survey. And then he was also a professor of geomicrobiology at Open University. So lots of great career experiences to talk about today. Now, Charles is here with us today to tell us all about this journey he's had through life and science. So, Charles, today we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off with just telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, when I'm not doing science, it sounds very simple. I like walking in the hills, walking in wilderness. I think just getting away from the lab and from the office, it's actually shocking how much time you spend in an office as you progress in your career, dealing with administration and things you need to do to run a research group. And there's nothing nicer than just getting away from that into wildlife, out into the outside, breathing air, going for a hike across the hill. So that's what I really enjoy most, just escaping the confines of a university and getting out into the outside world.
I love that. Getting some fresh air, getting some quiet time. Now, are you one of these people that's sort of addicted to the pedometer or the Fitbit, something like that counts your steps as you walk?
No, I don't do that. I'm not that obsessive. In fact, that's precisely what I don't want to do. When I get away from research, I think the enjoyment is actually not to think too much about what you're doing. Just open your mind up. You know, sometimes I get good scientific ideas. I'm not going to say I don't think about science sometimes when I'm out walking, but it is just good to release your mind from the intensity, I think, that science sometimes brings with it. And it's a way to relax. And that's, I think, why I enjoy walking, because you don't really have to think much. You can just allow your brain to throttle down a bit and think whatever it wants to think.
Well, I love that. I know myself, I'm much more of a walker than a runner. I think running takes too much of my concentration. So walking, you really can relax, right?
Yeah, running involves too much effort as well.
Right. Well, fantastic, Charles, to hear about how you spend your time when you're not at work, when you're not doing science. But next, we are going to ask you some questions about that scientific side. So can you tell us today how you describe your work, what you do, to someone who's not in science?
What I do is really try and understand how it is that life emerged and has persisted on the surface of a tiny little planet, two-thirds of the way out of a galaxy, for over 3.5 billion years. That's what really fascinates me. How did this phenomenon of life come about? How did it sustain itself over such a long time period on the surface of a tiny piece of rock? What is our place as a civilization in this unfolding story of life on the planet? And that's really the big question that sort of underpins what I do on a day-to-day basis in terms of research.
Well, that is a wonderful description of your work. I love building the context around it, kind of putting it in the big picture. So fantastic description there. And we'll be chatting more about the details of your research later in the interview. But I want to start next about sort of motivation. What motivates you? We talked about how you like to spend your time walking, kind of getting away from the science a little bit. But is there maybe a quote or a saying, a mantra that you keep in your mind as you go through your day that helps you stay motivated and focused?
Well, not really. I think what motivates me and what keeps me focused is an idea rather than a quote. And the idea is very simple, that we live on this planet as individuals have a very short time span here. And so what goes on in society on a day-to-day basis, how much money we earn, how much of our mortgage we have to pay off on our house, all these things are important for a day-to-day existence, but they don't really fundamentally underpin what it is that we're doing here. And that's what fascinates me, trying to understand how we arrived as a civilization on this planet, what the history of our emergence from earlier life was, and whether we're going to become a spacefaring civilization and move out beyond the Earth. And I think trying to understand that is what motivates me to go into work in the morning. That's what fascinates me, particularly the possibility of contributing to an understanding that will lead to a spacefaring civilization, the longevity of our civilization. That's what motivates me. So no particular quote. It's a general idea that is bigger than a single human life that really fascinates me and motivates the things that I do.
Very interesting. Well, I really like this idea that you're putting out there, sort of thinking outside the confines of the day-to-day. And I think so many of us listeners out there might agree that you get trapped in this to-do list that you have to do every day. It's hard to kind of step back and think about that big picture.
Yeah, and I think it's an important to-do list. I mean, we all have to exist and we all have to earn money to pay the bills. I mean, there's nothing, I certainly wouldn't belittle jobs and things that involve dealing with those day-to-day requirements for survival. But there's still that bigger question that underpins our existence. And I guess in some ways I'm privileged to be in a position where someone pays me to think about these questions and to do research that directly links to this larger question of what we're doing on this planet. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy about my job.
Certainly. And I've heard this from a lot of different scientists, just the fact that they can go in every day and get paid, that it's their job to think about these big questions, to start answering them. So wonderful to hear about what motivates you. Now, can you tell us, in addition to sort of this big idea that motivates you every day, were there some people that you encountered along your journey that really inspired or motivated you, maybe served as role models for you?
Well, I had an early experience that I guess was a very British experience in going to boarding school.
All right.
I went to boarding school when I was 7.5, and that was in Buckinghamshire countryside. And it was a fantastic place. We had a library. When you walked into the library, there was a portrait of Captain Scott and Ernest Shackleton. It was a very Victorian school. And also in our library, we had a very good section on space exploration. And so when I was young, I was exposed to an environment that was disconnected from home, that was very separate from the sort of family experience, but that also exposed me to this sort of Victorian ethos of exploration. And I have no idea why that was a particular strong theme in our school. It just was. I think it was just the nature of where that school came from and its origins. And so I was inspired by the early polar explorers, but at the same time, I would spend my time in the library reading books about the Apollo program, and books that, in the back pages of some of these books, were pictures of Mars stations. And by the 1980s, we were going to have bases on Mars, and we were all going to be living across the solar system. And I really thought when I was 7.5 that I would be going to Mars, and that in my future life, that was where I was going to go. And that really inspired me, and it had a very deep impact on my interest in science and exploration. I've no doubt that interest sort of came probably before that. I think you still have to have an interest in science to be inspired by it, and I've no idea where that came from. But there's little doubt that my early career created an environment in which those scientific and exploratory interests were nurtured.
Very, very cool. So we usually like to talk about sort of the earliest moment, the earliest memory that you can remember being excited about science. Was this maybe when you were 7.5, going to the library, starting to look at some of these space exploration books, or was there a particular event that you think maybe started triggering things of you turning towards a career in science?
I think it was a general thing. I think it was reading those books. Before I went to boarding school, I would go around my parents' garden collecting insects in boxes, and I would collect chrysalises from moths and butterflies and watch them hatch. So even before I was going to school, I was always very much interested in natural history, always exploring with friends in the village that I lived in, which was in the middle of the countryside in Essex in England. I would go out into the countryside and we would make maps of these fields and forests that I lived near. So this happened very early. So it was no specific event. I think as long as I can remember, I was always exploring and doing science, and it sort of became more ingrained in me when I went to boarding school and had the opportunity to read about these things.
Very interesting. So can you pinpoint along your journey, were there any key moments or maybe some of these big events that happened that really you think propelled you to where you are today?
There were a lot of things early on in my career, or early on in my life, even before I had a career. For example, the next boarding school I went to, which was when I was 13, I spent about a year building an underwater city in my room, a little model one.
Oh, wow. Are we talking like in a fish tank, or?
Yeah, it was a giant fish tank, and I had these metal containers that had a fan on the top to drive air through them. And they had tubes you could put food in. And I actually had cockroaches living underwater in this underwater city at school. And
you had me until you said cockroaches. No.
So I had this underwater city with cockroaches in this fish tank. And again, I think, a crucial part of all this, it's not necessary, but it's helpful, I think, was to be away from home. I mean, I'm not sure what my parents would have thought about underwater cities with cockroaches in. But when you're at boarding school, you can do these things because no one's going to stop you from doing it. And so I think, despite the fact that English boarding schools can be fairly restrictive environments, for me at least, I found it quite liberating because I was able to pursue ideas and do things that allowed me to express my interest. I mean, the next step in building this underwater city was actually to send out application forms in the town where the school was. I sent out about 1,000 of them through people's letterboxes to get people to join up for the full-scale city when I eventually was going to build this thing. And I, wrote to Maggie Thatcher, who was Prime Minister then, and she wrote a letter back saying this is a fantastic idea. And all these things, I think, propelled my scientific interests. And I think most importantly, and again, I think this is a very important experience in early life, it gave me the confidence to believe that I could succeed, that I could do things that other people would take an interest in. And that gives you confidence to realize this is something that you can do, science in general, and drives you along in that direction even further. So I think these sorts of things were quite formative in my early years in recognizing that I could set up science projects, get people involved, and make them a success as well.
Well, Charles, that is an incredible story. So I must ask, is this underwater city something that you still have on your mind today? Is this coming in the future, or are you putting that on hold for now?
I'm putting it on hold. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, when actually, people were talking about living at the bottom of the oceans. It was quite a popular idea at the time. It seems to have waned since then, I think because of the complexity of doing it. But clearly there are a lot of resources in the oceans that might be able to sustain people. But I think it's probably more difficult to get a population to live in the oceans than was thought in the late 70s.
Fantastic story. I love hearing about these early experiences of you exploring science and this idea of getting other people engaged and involved in your big ideas. That is wonderful. So speaking of big ideas, can you tell us about one of these projects, something that you're working on right now that you are just the most excited about?
Yeah, we have a very exciting project that we started 2 years ago. We have been building the world's first underground astrobiology lab, a kilometre under the ground, in an active mine in England. There's a potash mine in northeast England called Bulby Mine, and it's a 1 kilometre deep mine that has over 1,000 kilometres of roadways that go out underneath the North Sea for mining salt. And it's been host for about 10 days to an underground lab where they've been looking for dark matter. And they look for dark matter down there because it's screened from cosmic radiation coming in from outer space. And about 2 years ago, we went to the mine and said, can we take over part of this lab and build an astrobiology lab to look at life deep underground, the sorts of creatures, sorts of microbes that live a kilometre underground in these very dark salts. So we've now finished building this astrobiology lab. As I say, it's the world's first underground astrobiology lab. And we've been using it to look for life deep underground, to understand what's living down there, but also to test out technologies for the long-term robotic and human exploration of underground environments on the Moon and Mars, eventually possibly human habitats deep under the surface of Mars in lava tubes. So we've also been building a program around our lab to test robotic technologies. We were down there only just a few months ago testing different types of instruments that are going to be sent to Mars on future rovers to look for life. And so this is very, very exciting because it's not only a way for us to advance science, to understand what sort of organisms live deep underground and can survive in the crust of the Earth, but also a way for us to use that science to advance technology testing for the long-term robotic and human exploration of space. So we're really excited about that, and we're building up this robotic program underground over the next few years. It's now been running for a couple of years. And that's one of the main projects that we've been developing through the UK Centre for Astrobiology that I set up in Edinburgh also about 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, Charles, this sounds spectacular. So if we were to walk into this phenomenal underground laboratory, what are some of the key differences that you would notice between your average laboratory above ground and what you're seeing down there?
Well, amazingly not much. I mean, the mine, of course, is a very, very different environment. It's a huge set of roadways and caverns through which mining equipment moves. But the lab is in a separate area of the mine near the main shaft where people come up and down and where equipment gets taken up and down. But it's a sealed lab. It's clean. You need to go in there in these bunny suits to keep the lab clean because the instruments for dark matter detection are very sensitive. So it's got air conditioning, it's got internet. And in fact, when you're in the lab, you wouldn't even guess you were underground, apart from the fact that everyone is wearing hard hats.
Right. You might not have windows, right?
Yeah, there's no windows. And you have to wear hard hats just because it's a mining health and safety regulation that regardless of what you're doing, you have to wear a hard hat. So that's the only way in which you would tell that you were actually deep underground. Otherwise, you wouldn't know at all. And in some sense, that's what's remarkable about it. The fact that you walk out of this roadway that's covered in salts in this dark, extreme environment into this high-tech laboratory a kilometer underground. It's really a very spectacular environment to work in.
Well, you have painted an incredible picture of what you're working on right now, your life as a scientist, some of these exciting things that you get to do. And I know there are so many amazing things that you get to do as a scientist and great days that you have, but there are also some bad days, some problems that you encounter as a scientist. And I do like to talk about those on our show as well, because I think when you look in the media, oftentimes you see the success stories of science and you don't hear about all the roadblocks, all the obstacles, all the problems that scientists had before that moment. So can you take us back in your career, Charles, and tell us about one of these moments of failure, of challenge, and tell us how you worked through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge in science is funding. I mean, I said earlier that I feel very privileged to be a scientist, but it takes a lot of work to get there because it is something that, you know, isn't necessarily immediately linked to everyday lives. It's easier for governments and private corporations to find reasons to fund someone who's sorting out, you know, sanitation in a city than it is someone thinking about life on Mars. And so it's a tough journey to get into a position where you actually can think about these things and be paid to do it. And I think in the early part of your career, when you're not established, the difficulty is funding. I mean, I went for my PhD and did a postdoctoral position at NASA Ames in California. That was fantastic. But when that was finished, I didn't have a position, so I had to go and find some temporary money somewhere else. So I went down to Arizona and there was some money there. And then I ran out of money there and went back up to Ames. And then, because I wasn't a U.S. citizen, I wasn't going to get a civil servant slot at NASA. So I ran out of money there and then had to apply for lots of positions in the UK. So when you look back on my career, it looks like it's very planned. It looks like that I've certainly have had these interests from a very young age, but the actual trajectory is not smooth sailing, and it's taken a lot of persistence to get funding and to get into positions where you actually have salary. And there were a number of years there where, you know, it wasn't certain at all that I would find a job or even have a salary to pay for what I wanted to do. There's always the thought that you might have to completely change position and go off and do some job in industry that's even unconnected with science. So it is challenging, but it has all worked out. And I think part of that, like anything in life, is deliberately and persistently pursuing what you really want to do. And strangely, things do have a habit of falling into place if you're persistent enough. But it was a challenge earlier on, and even today it's still a challenge. I have to write grant proposals to bring in money, and if I don't bring in the money, the university won't be happy with me. So it doesn't stop. It's an ongoing challenge to fund the things that we want to do.
Well, I think you brought up so many important points. And I think this message about persistence, about this career, you know, sort of winding paths that a lot of scientists take, you can't hear that message enough. It's very reassuring for myself, and I'm sure other listeners out there who are going through this process in the early stages of their career, trying to get there with this end goal in sight, but not knowing how all the pieces are going to fall into place to get there. And I think, you know, you kind of can't plan all these things 5 steps ahead. You have to sort of see what opportunities are available at the time and go for it. So you brought up a really interesting point too about being an international scientist. And I think, science is becoming more and more collaborative, more and more international. And you mentioned some particular challenges that you face.
I think certainly doing science internationally is a great opportunity, and that's the positive side of it, that you get the opportunity to go and work in labs around the world. But the underlying reason for that is often not necessarily, I'm going to go and work in another country because it's a fantastic opportunity. It's where the resources and funding are. And I went and worked at NASA definitely because that was a childhood dream. I spent most of my PhD pestering people at NASA until someone gave me a postdoctoral position. So I was quite determined to go there. The decision to come back to the UK was more of a funding thing than a location thing. I needed to get salary, and as I was not a US citizen, it was difficult for me to find positions or apply for positions universities or in government institutions like NASA that generally require US citizenship. And a position came up in the UK, the British Antarctic Survey, which was also another place that I had always quite wanted to work at and go down to Antarctica. So when that came up, I certainly wasn't going to turn it down, and that offered me a route to a permanent position. But whether I was going to work in the US or the UK was very open. I was quite ready to stay in the US as well, but a good position came up in the UK, and I try and maintain good connections with friends and colleagues in the US to this day. And as you say, science is international. Borders really don't exist in scientific questions. So as long as you can find yourself in a laboratory or in a university that allows you to do what you want to do, it probably doesn't matter that much where you are. I mean, obviously you want to be in a country that supports science generally, but as long as that's there, I think these days it doesn't really matter where you are.
Absolutely. Well, and I really wanted to chat about this experience you had with the British Antarctic Survey. I know I mentioned it in our introduction. So what was it like doing research in Antarctica?
Antarctica is a really special environment. It's actually very difficult to explain. I think this sounds a very sort of slightly trivial thing to say, but the lack of trees is what I think makes a big difference, because when you go there, there's no sense of perspective or distance, because you don't have trees. It could be lack of buildings as well. And there's nothing to give you a sense of distance. So you sit there on this continent, looking out across this vast ice sheet, and in the distance there's the Transantarctic Mountains. And they could be a kilometer away, or they could be hundreds of kilometers away. It's very, very difficult to tell. And so this very special sense of space down there that I've never experienced anywhere else on the Earth. And you can sit there in a place where there's no one else. I mean, for example, one field trip I went down there, we were down there about 6 of us. We were dropped off by aircraft into a deep field site, just 6 of us with some canvas tents and our food and our science equipment. And we had our French geophysicist with us, and she had this very mysterious rucksack that she wouldn't tell us what was in it. And then about a month into this, she pulled out the rucksack and brought it out onto the glacier. And the first thing she pulled out was this white tablecloth that she put onto one of these ration boxes. And then she pulled out a bottle of wine. And then she pulled out this camembert cheese that had been nicely festering for about a month. And then she pulled out these biscuits. And we had this French picnic on this glacier. In the Antarctic, there was probably no one on the same degree of latitude on the Earth where we were in Antarctica. And it was just the most surreal, extraordinary experience, doing research and then having this picnic in the middle of nowhere. And there's nowhere else on the Earth you can have that experience, that totally isolated experience where there's just the sound of wind rippling across this vast glacier in complete emptiness, surrounded by the white of Antarctica, the tops of entire mountain ranges stuck up above this glacial ice sheet, this vast expanse of nothing. And I think that's a very unique experience. In some ways, I expect what being on Mars is a bit like, or being in outer space is like, the sense of isolation and desolation, but something very beautiful about it.
Well, that sounds just like an awe-inspiring experience to be down there, surrounded by nothing but snow and ice, and then just having this very normal French picnic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That is incredible. So wonderful to hear about your experiences down there. And I think scientists have so many exciting opportunities. We don't want to just talk about the tough times like we did some of these challenges in funding. We love to talk about the exciting times in science as well. So what I want to hear about next is one of these success stories from your lab or from your career. So can you tell us about one of these moments that really meant a lot to you?
I think there are a lot of things that have meant a lot to me. I have to say, I think the things I get most pleasure out of is building new projects and seeing that influence other people and make other people get excited about science. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily come from science, but it also comes from teaching. The science is great, and my research group is excellent, and seeing students get the thrill of doing research is always exciting. There's also something very exciting about giving lectures on astrobiology to the undergraduates that I teach, and having undergraduates come up to you and express an enthusiasm for science. I mean, I've seen undergraduates come out of my astrobiology course and decide, that's what they want to do. I had a student come up to me this last year at the end of the course and said, the questions that have been raised in astrobiology, I've really decided this is what I want to do for my career. This is what I'm going to do. This is where I want to go with thinking about my life and the sorts of questions that fascinate me. So I think that sort of thing, it's the simple little things of seeing a human being motivated and excited about thinking on the big questions of human existence on the Earth, how they might be able to make that better, how they might be able to contribute. That's what really gives me a kick, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I like this description that you're giving of sort of building the projects, of getting people excited, sort of the initial steps of science that people get excited about. And I think it's interesting when I reflect on some of the conversations I've had with scientists, and I think some people are surprised at how much they end up liking teaching. It's one of those things you expect to just be part of the job. But once you get those students in the classroom, once you see their faces light up, those aha moments where something suddenly clicks and makes sense, or they start getting excited about science, I think that really has a big impact on people. Was this something that you expected you'd be so excited about teaching?
Yeah, and I think it's a very important part of getting the next generation involved in science, because it often is something very, very simple, like a lecture or an idea, that can completely change someone's view of what they want to do. And so I think engaging with the next generation, teaching them, I know it's a cliche to say so, but I think it's something very, very important to be enthusiastic about. It's easy to do the science and to make the contribution there, but you have to pass that on to the next generation, and sometimes just simple ideas are what makes the difference.
Absolutely. Well, Charles, it's great to hear about these moments in science that really mean a lot to you and get you excited about going to work in the morning. And I know scientists have that to-do list that tends to be a mile long, with teaching, with science, with all the things they have to balance in a day. And it makes it hard to carve out time for, things like going for long walks, things like enjoying a good book, all these other things you want to get done in a day. But I have gotten so many phenomenal book recommendations from scientists we've had on our program. So I'm going to ask you for one today. Can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed that you think our listeners should check out?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of books I've enjoyed. I think the most recent one I read, which was a few months ago, that I did really enjoy, was quite a serious book, but it's called The Science of Liberty by Tim Ferriss. And it's a really interesting exploration of what sort of conditions you need in a country for science to be successful, for people to be able to think freely. And I guess it's not just connected to science, it's connected to free human minds generally. What sort of conditions do you need for people to be able to think expansively about the world around them, about the nature of the universe? I don't think it's a coincidence that the first people to think about the universe and to think about its structure were the ancient Greeks, who also invented democracy. And this is Tim Ferriss's argument that science and the freedom to think freely is inextricably linked to the sorts of societies that we create and the sorts of conditions that we make for people to be free and to be unrestricted in the way in which they explore their own ideas, their own motivations. And so that was a very fascinating book for me, because there's a lot of books on liberty, and of course this goes back over centuries, but I think this was one of the first books that I've seen that very consciously linked the conditions for interesting and good science to political conditions for freedom. So as I say, it's rather a serious book. It's not
light reading, right?
Light reading, but it's a fascinating book, and it is an easy book to read. It's not necessarily an academic book. Anyone can pick this up, and I think if you want a more serious book to read that does have a lot of interesting ideas, that's a particularly good book. Otherwise, I read almost anything from science fiction to other types of fiction as well, although I get a lamentable lack of time to do that these days.
Understandable. Well, excellent recommendations for our listeners out there. We are going to put them out on our website, on our resources tab, so our listeners can find the Tim Ferriss book that you mentioned. Fantastic choice. Now, we've talked about some of the opportunities that you've had to travel for science, and I think you've been to some incredible places, have some wonderful opportunities. Can you think back now, Charles, on all the travel you've done for science, for research, for conferences, all the scope of things, and tell us about your favorite place and just why it was your favorite?
Yeah, well, I'll try and keep the story as brief as possible. But
I'm sitting down. Take your time. Yeah.
Okay. I once went on an expedition to Mongolia that I'm actually not going to tell you about. We were collecting moths, and we were trying to collect moths from trees. And one of the reasons why people study moths and butterflies is that they're very sensitive to changes in their environment. So you can use them as an environmental indicator. When their populations start changing, that tells you something's going on in the environment that might not be good. So we were collecting moths for the Natural History Museum, and we couldn't get them to come down from the trees, which is where they were living. We had these bright lights that were supposed to attract them down. So we sat around a campfire in the middle of the Mongolian steppe, and I said, well, wouldn't it be fantastic if you could design an aircraft that would catch moths? So when I came back from Mongolia, I designed and built with some engineering colleagues a moth-catching ultralight aircraft. And this was an aircraft that had a giant scoop underneath for catching moths. It had ultraviolet lamps for attracting moths and giant lamps so you could see, because you have to fly this thing at dusk when the moths are around. And so I went off and got my ultralight pilot's license, and we took the moth machine out to the rainforests of Indonesia, and I flew it over the rainforests of Sumatra, catching moths in 1993, the summer of 93. And 4 of us from Oxford University, which is where I was at the time, went out there. And I went moth catching in this microlight. And that, again, was an experience that's very difficult to describe, flying over the tops of pristine rainforests in the middle of Indonesia on a tropical summer's evening in a moth-catching ultralight aircraft.
This sounds incredible. This is a great story.
And I did this for about a month, and then there is actually quite a wild ending to this, because as I was coming into land about halfway through, it clipped the top of a tree and it crashed. It hit the ground nose first. It somersaulted 3 times, and luckily the propeller hit the ground and shattered, and that shut the engine off, because the thing basically broke in half, and the engine came down on top of my head, and I crawled out unharmed, which I think to this day was still quite remarkable, because the moth machine was completely destroyed. I had a couple of bruises, and that was it, but otherwise I was unharmed. And that was the end of the experiment in moth catching with an aircraft, which unsurprisingly I've not done since then.
Well, you went out with a bang, right?
Yeah, it was an incredible expedition, and we had an editorial in the Times newspaper defending this expedition from Bernard Levin. Afterwards, it got quite a lot of coverage. But quite apart from the experience, going back to your question, which was travel, I think that rainforest is another environment on the Earth that's truly stunning if you can go and see it, not just from above, but also from below. You walk through a rainforest, it's like a giant cathedral. You have these sun rays that come through the top of the canopy, and the vastness of it is just awe-inspiring. And I think, to get a bit more serious, the destruction of the rainforest is not just bad for biodiversity, but it's a tragic destruction of a very beautiful environment on the Earth. And if anyone out there, any of the listeners, have the opportunity to go and experience rainforest and to get a sense of why we should be protecting this environment, I would really recommend any opportunity you can take to see pristine, undestroyed rainforest.
Certainly. Well, it must have been a powerful experience, too, to be able to see it sort of from above through this ultralight aircraft, and then also from the ground, both perspectives of the rainforest.
Yeah, I think it was. It was fun as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this sounds like an incredible experience, being able to be there in the rainforest. Now, where exactly were you? We
were in Sumatra, just north of the town of Bengkulu, which is on the west coast of Sumatra. We actually drove up to Bengkulu, and then we had a 4x4 with a trailer that we'd actually got made in Jakarta for the moth machine in the back. And we drove up, and we actually set up camp in an old school on the edge of the rainforest that had a giant playground that wasn't being used, of course, but we used that as an airstrip, basically. An ultralight can take off in quite a short distance, so we used that to take off and then fly over the rainforest. And then we were also catching moths and butterflies on the ground. And this was part of an effort to establish the Kerinci Seblat National Park, which is a rainforest national park that exists to this day, that is protected. So we were there actually in quite the early stages when they were still building up this national park.
Wow. Well, wonderful to hear about this experience that you've had, and great to hear that you were able to escape this incident with the ultralight relatively unscathed. So definitely one thing you have to consider. I mean, doing field research, there's a lot of risks that I think a lot of people don't realize. I mean, you are out there in the field. It's sort of you and your devices trying to do science and survive out there in a lot of cases. So
yeah, you have to be careful. I mean, to this day, I look back now and think, what on earth was I thinking? I mean, I was just crazy. But I think there's also an element of being young and thinking you're invincible. I mean, I was, 24, 25 when I did that. So I had a different state of mind than I do now. But yes, I mean, you do have to be careful. Field work can be risky in any country. Even just driving on the other side of the road is something that claims a lot of accidents. So I think that's one of the perils. But you can overcome those things just by being sensible. I wouldn't necessarily include flying moth-catching ultralights in that camp. But
might not recommend it to future scientists. Yeah.
Apart from that, you can be sensible.
Wonderful. Well, great to hear about some of these experiences that you've had, Charles. And I love chatting with scientists about their experience, about their lives, about their journeys in science, and maybe breaking some of the stereotypes about scientists along the way. And I think a lot of people perceive scientists, especially with how they're portrayed in the media, as very serious, very austere, cold, kind of put your lab coat on and go in every day. And we like to talk about some of the other sides of science. So some of the funny things that you do, some of the traditions, some of the friendships that you form. So can you share with us today one of these maybe funny science memories, or even just a tradition that you've experienced in a particular lab going through?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fun and enjoyment in labs, I think, and on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to pick something to tell you that's actually not involving a lab, but it does involve how science can take you in a very fun direction, I think, that's very different. Another thing that happened when I was working in the lab at Oxford is I was sitting around in a pub with some of my lab friends talking about Mars exploration, and we were saying how it was a pity that Britain was not involved in as much Mars exploration as it might be, and this was back in 1991. And it was about 2 months before the general election, and they said, well, if you feel so strongly about this, why don't you stand in the general election? And in the UK, you can stand in what are called constituencies, which are regions of the UK where particular people stand. And John Major, who was the Prime Minister at that time, stood in the Huntingdon constituency, which is up near Cambridge. And so I got in my little mini car and drove up there with some of my lab friends, and we formed the Forward to Mars Party. And we got the signatures that we needed to form a political party and stood against the Prime Minister for an increased involvement of Britain in Mars exploration and the construction of a British station on Mars. And one of the traditions of election campaigns is that all the candidates have to meet in the town hall to take questions from the general public. It doesn't matter whether you're the Prime Minister or anyone else. You have to go to the town hall and take part in this meeting. So there I was in Huntingdon Town Hall, a tiny little place, with about 100 people packed into this town hall, with John Major, the Prime Minister, sitting at the same table.
Wow.
And all of the other candidates, which included Lord Buckethead, who was this man who wore this bucket over his head, myself, a member of the Labour Party. And we went through these questions, and one of the questions was, what are you going to do about unemployment? And, of course, all the other parties responded, including John Major, about their policies on unemployment. And we were the Forward to Mars Party, so we had to respond with our unemployment policy for Mars, which was, of course, that, you don't want unemployed people in a planetary station on Mars because they might get angry and throw something through the hull of the habitat and cause depressurization. So unemployment and criminality is bad in space. So I was explaining all this. And that was a hilarious experience. I mean, what are you going to do about milk deliveries was another question. And, of course, you can argue that for Huntingdon, and John Major was explaining how he would improve milk deliveries, and I was explaining how we won't have cows on Mars for some time, so we'll probably need synthetic milk, and we can think about farms on Mars in some future point in time. So this was a hilarious experience, very, very funny. We ended up getting 91 votes. We beat a party called the Natural Law Party, but of course John Major got about 55,000 votes, so we didn't get into Parliament, unfortunately.
Right.
But it was an extraordinary experience. It was much fun. And I think although there was a sort of serious part to it, which was to try and raise awareness of space exploration in Britain, I think it is a demonstration of how scientists can be fun as well, and how we can have a fun time doing what we're doing and experience some interesting traditions. In the case of that particular experience, the tradition of parliamentary democracy in Britain, but done through our own political party with a lot of fun and with all my lab colleagues. So in some sense, it ties back to having fun with people in your lab as well.
Well, I'm sure your group brought some personality. You brought a little bit of entertainment to the meeting. That is phenomenal. So was the audience getting sort of into it? Were they responding well to your answers to the questions?
Yeah, they were. And we spent about 2 weeks or so beforehand driving around in my Mini. My brother-in-law from one of my sisters came over and put a loudspeaker system on my car. So we would drive around Huntingdon campaigning, and we got really positive responses. Our campaign slogan was, "It's time for a change of planet." And we would go around Huntingdon giving lectures on Mars exploration. And, people love this. I think in the UK as well, people have a very strong sense that this whole process should be open to anyone. So we had a very, very fun experience talking to people about space exploration and just getting involved in this whole parliamentary campaign. So it was a great experience. We met a lot of people on the street. And, the other thing that was quite fun about it is I met a lot of people on the street that I wouldn't normally have met in my career, people from a whole range of backgrounds that, unless you go and work in some other field or some other job, you never meet people from the vast array of backgrounds of people just walking around on the street. So that was also a lot of fun.
Absolutely. This sounds like an incredible experience and a just wonderful opportunity to get your message out there, to raise awareness, to connect with people that, like you said, you would never otherwise get an opportunity to meet, and who, in a lot of cases, would never really get an opportunity to meet you or a scientist who is trying to share their information. So I think this is really an important area for science to get into. I know, science and politics tend to sort of not mix super well, but I think there are so many opportunities for scientists to become active, to become involved, and to get their message out as well. So great to hear that you participated in that.
Yeah, I think it's good for scientists to get out there as well, because there is this stereotype, as you said, that scientists are very, very serious and we just think all the time about quite serious aspects of our work. But it's not necessarily the case. And I think actually going out and mixing with the public in any sort of forum is also just good for scientists, because it also gives you a better understanding of what people on the street think about science, and maybe gives you ideas about how to project your science in different ways that connect more readily with what people are thinking about science and what sort of things interest people outside science.
Definitely. Knowing how to convey what you're doing in a way that's meaningful to people, I think, is so important in science. And, we talked about some of these big ideas, some of these big questions that you're starting to have the opportunity to answer in your line of research. But I'm curious about what is the biggest question in your mind, the one thing that you would love to know the answer to, if these issues, these things standing in the way, things like funding, staff, technology, feasibility, the barriers in science, were out of the way. What is this one question in your mind that you are dreaming to answer?
I think the one big question, and it's not just my question, I actually think it's the big question for science and humanity, is there intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? I think that's a fundamental question. And when I say fundamental, I mean something that everyone can understand. I mean, a 6-year-old doesn't turn to their parents and say, "Oh, can you explain to me the nitrogen cycle in a plant?" Or "Can you explain to me the subatomic structure of a neutron?" But 6-year-olds do turn to their parents and they say, "Is there anyone out there?" And I think the reason for that is that this is a question that's hardwired into the human brain. We wonder as individuals whether we're alone, whether people agree with us, whether there's other people on our side. I mean, these are things that worry us as individuals as we go through our lives. And so I think this idea of being alone applies to the level of the species as well. Are we alone on this planet? Or is this where our civilization is destined to die? It's a really big question, and it hits at the heart of what is the purpose of all of this, or what have we decided we're going to make the purpose of our existence here in the long term? So that's the question I would really like to see answered. Is there intelligent life? And then a follow-up question to that, of course, is, will we ever communicate with them or meet with them? It's one thing to have an intelligent civilization, 10 galaxies away, but that might do us no good if we can never, ever get there. So answering the question would be great. And then the second question would be, will we ever communicate and speak with this other intelligence or other intelligences if they exist elsewhere in the universe? And as I say, I think that's my big question, but I actually think it's a big question for civilization as a whole.
I think you're absolutely right. I think if you asked a lot of people, people on the street, scientists, a mix of people, what is the one big scientific question that they want to see answered? I think a lot of people would respond this, is there life out there, or is there intelligent life out there type of question? So can you point out, I know there's a ton of barriers in the way standing between us and being able to answer it, but what is, I guess, the most immediate barrier that you see, or the one that's most pressing to keep you from taking that next step to getting to answer it?
Unfortunately, it always comes down to the same thing. It's money.
Right.
I mean, if you had unlimited money, the technology is there to build telescopes to look for trace gases that could indicate biology in distant Earth-like planets. If you had the money, we could start to establish stations on other planets. I mean, that wouldn't necessarily help us answer the question of whether there are intelligences on other planetary bodies, but it would help us to become a spacefaring civilization, which is the first step possibly to traveling beyond. So all of these things take money. Of course, they also take political will. People have to be willing and wanting to do these things. The conditions have to be right for that. So we have to get all of those things right. But I have some sort of optimism. I think that with commercial access to space, the costs will come down. It may be easier to do that. And I think that there is sufficiently broad public interest in finding life beyond the Earth. There's support for these missions to build telescopes to look for Earth-like planets around other stars. So it will happen. I think the question is, when does it happen? And I suppose from a more selfish point of view, how much will happen in my lifetime? Of course,
right.
I'd like
to see it, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see a permanent station on Mars. I'd like to see the detection of an Earth-like planet with oxygen in its atmosphere suggesting life. And I'd like to see communication with extraterrestrial intelligences. But, being in a position to just contribute to that, regardless of whether it happens, I think is exciting enough. But, of course, the icing on the cake would be to see some of these things come to fruition in my lifetime.
Absolutely. Well, I think this funding issue comes up a lot in conversations with scientists, and it is a big challenge today for a lot of scientists, because you're right. When you have the funding, the technology, the staff, all that sort of can come along with it. But I think you're right, too, in pointing out that we need these almost stepping stones out to other planets to be able to continue pushing the barriers there towards answering that question. So very, very great question to think about in response, and sort of the steps that we need to take to be able to address it. Now, I know we chatted a lot about your experiences in science, your journey. And I know as a scientist, you have a lot of mentors. You get a lot of advice along the way as you're going through. It's not a solitary endeavor. So can you share with us today, Charles, what you would consider the best advice that you've ever received?
I think the best advice I've ever received, and again, it's a bit of a cliche bit of advice, but I actually think it works, which is to pursue your ambitions or your dreams with a tenacity and perseverance, regardless of what people think. I think there's a lot of human beings out there who actually do admire other human beings that have a vision and a dream. And if you project that, it's surprising how people come out of the woodwork at critical moments in your life to help you. It's not obvious beforehand. There's a sort of leap of faith in believing that people will be there when you need them. But in fact, they are. And there's enough people out there that want to see civilization be a success, that are willing to help young people who look like they're doing something interesting and something with a sense of determination. And the greatest advice I think I've ever been given is just to pursue your dream, not belligerently and not in an unpleasant way. You must always do it with consideration to others, but in a persistent way. And to keep going through the bad times. And usually things will fall into place. And even if they don't, they will generate new opportunities that take you off in a direction you didn't expect, that is still very positive and still a very productive thing to do. So I think that's the best advice. I mean, yes, if you really want to put it in a crude way, don't let the bastards get you down. Right. Is the other way, is the less polite way of putting the advice.
Well, very well said, Charles, and great advice. I think you covered so many important points there, just on being persistent, having those big ideas, but also not being afraid to pursue them, to share them, to get other people excited and invested in them. So fantastic advice for our listeners out there. Is there any other last piece of advice, or maybe a last piece of inspiration that you want to share with our listeners today, now coming from you personally?
No, I think the last bit of advice I would give is really going back to what I said at the beginning, and I think what we talked about earlier, which is it's very easy to get caught up in the everyday problems of life, and those problems, whatever they may be, are important. It's part of living to deal with the everyday challenges. But I think that the best advice I give to my students is also to keep your eye on the idea that, life is short and you want to make a contribution that you can do. I think the advice is to pursue what interests you, to stick with the things that fascinate you and that you're passionate about, and pursue them deliberately and doggedly, and don't allow things to get you off the track, because there's not enough time to be pushed off from what you want to do by other people. So I think sticking with your dreams and your ideas, and as I said earlier, even if they don't work out, using that to then think about something else, but continuing forward with the things that inspire you and give you passion in life is what you have to do. I think if you do that, you will have a fulfilled life.
Well, wonderful words of wisdom, Charles, for our listeners out there. Can you tell them now how they can reach out to learn more about you or the research that we talked about today?
Yeah, well, I'm on email, and my email address is c.s.cockell@ed.ac.uk, or you can put Charles Cockell into Google, and my webpage on the university will also come up, and that's the best way to contact me.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, feel free to get in touch with Charles if you have any particular questions, and definitely check out more of the amazing work that he is doing. And Charles, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a bit of your story.
Not at all. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to chat about ideas.
Well, it was wonderful to chat with you as well. Thank you out there to our listeners. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.